Hello, Freedom Friends! Big news this week. Well, big news that for some reason hasn't really caught on. So the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals made a Second Amendment decision this week that I'm actually really surprised I haven't seen more angry headlines about. Even Googling only brought up mostly pro-gun articles, with the exception of Wichita's local CBS affiliate and one ABC article. Just one. Basically, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that in some cases, people convicted of domestic violence can still legally own a gun, and for some reason, the anti-gun media isn't all over this. The decision was made around the case of Alexander Poller out in Kansas, who was convicted of misdemeanor domestic battery under a city ordinance. Current federal law does forbid someone from owning a gun if they've been convicted of domestic violence, but federal law specifically states that the charge would be under federal, state, or tribal law, which technically doesn't include municipal or city ordinances if we're arguing specifics. The three-judge panel ruled on the case of USA versus Alexander J. Poller in a pretty short and succinct 9-page document. The court ruled that yes, in fact, there is a distinction between state, local, and federal governments, as well as a difference between state statutes and municipal ordinances. There's also a limitation in the can't possess a gun law that excludes misdemeanors punishable by under 2 years in jail. So that's part of it too. The government, aka the USA part in the USA versus Alexander J. Poller, argued that the phrase state law implies that local governments are also included, despite the fact that later in the law, the government does differentiate expressly between state and local governments. So yes, semantics, but remember that just a couple months ago, an entire court case was decided on proper comma usage. So really, this isn't that surprising. All of this has some pretty far-reaching implications, as according to an investigative report by Press of Atlantic City, about 43% of all domestic violence cases are heard in municipal courts. And plea bargains to get a guilty plea on a local ordinance rather than a state statute are pretty common, as in a lot of cases there's not really much evidence except one person's word against another. So I think that this ends up becoming a really tough situation, because I fully believe that anyone has the right to defend themselves, and saying who is and isn't allowed to own a gun is pretty similar to saying who does and doesn't have the right to defend themselves if the need arises, and that certainly shouldn't be my or any government's decision. I mean, it's just not my place to say, you there, you can't defend yourself. Oh, but you can. Are violent people more dangerous if they have access to guns? Absolutely. I don't want anyone to think that I'm denying that, because I'm not. But someone who is prone to violence, especially domestic violence, is going to be violent regardless of the tools at their disposal. And I'd argue that if someone is really considered so dangerous and violent that they can't properly function in society without inflicting harm, then maybe they shouldn't be in society. Because if you think some violent person has the potential to murder another human being if they get a gun, or at least very seriously harm them, then really all the government is doing is legislating what tools they can use to hurt someone. It doesn't actually stop the harm from happening, and honestly, it doesn't really stop them from getting a gun either. There are plenty of illegal guns lying around if you know the right person. Just go to Brockton. Certainly, I don't want anyone to get hurt, and I believe aggression in and of itself is wrong unless used in a self-defense situation, but I also don't know how much current law really does to stop actual violence. I've worked with victims, I've worked with abusers, and I've worked with accused abusers. And I make this distinction because, unfortunately, because there's often no evidence and it's one person's word against another, sometimes people do get unfairly charged. There are also places like Massachusetts that don't have self-defense laws, and punching someone who is threatening you with a knife, for example, can get you an assault or domestic violence conviction. Then there's the question of what actually constitutes domestic violence. Pushing someone? Maybe. Punching someone? Yeah. All other manner of serious threats and physical harm? Absolutely. But I've also seen people come into my office with domestic violence convictions because they threw a soft, children's toy at their spouse during a verbal argument. I've seen people get charged because they grabbed a partner's wrists when the partner was trying to hit them. I've seen people get charged and convicted because a partner charged at them and they tried to push the person away. This obviously isn't the norm, and I am not claiming that it is, but unfortunately these things do happen, and they happen disproportionately to men because a lot of people don't believe that women are also capable of violence, even though the National Domestic Violence Hotline cites very similar statistics for both men and women who have experienced intimate partner violence, and the numbers are virtually equal for psychological aggression. So there's clearly some systemic bias on this one. Anyway, I am not saying to just give violent people free rein on owning as many guns as they please. I'm simply saying that no one issue is ever just black and white, and the system as it stands is very far from perfect. In fact, I would argue that it is terribly flawed. In an ideal world, everyone would be able to defend themselves against violence, whether man or woman. Mental health help would always be readily available for the men, women, and children who have experienced abuse, and shelters would always have open beds for the people who need them. Or actually, I guess in an ideal world, aggressive violence just wouldn't exist. But until then, at the very least, every case has to be looked at very carefully and critically to make sure that the right decisions are being made and that everyone involved is getting the help and resources they need, because unfortunately in every blanket law or decision there's going to be those people that just really don't fit. And please, if you or a loved one is experiencing domestic violence, do not hesitate to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They offer 24/7 support both on their website and at the phone hotline, which is 1-800-799-7233. I will put it at the bottom of the screen here for anyone who needs it, and I will also put it down in the description. Again, it is 1-800-799-7233. So thanks for watching, and until next week, stay safe and happy shooting.